Welcome to the show. This is your host, David Yanis, and we have a very special guest with us, and Mr. Andrew Root. How you doing, Andrew?
Good. How are you doing?
We're doing great. We got his book, The Relational Pastor, and I want to talk about that with him. We got 10 minutes, but we're going to try and get as much as we can in 10 minutes.
All right, here we go.
Hey, man, tell us what is the book about? And first, tell us a little bit about yourself. Everybody likes to know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I teach practical theology classes and youth ministry classes at Luther Seminary in cold Minneapolis, St. Paul. That spring has just barely arrived here,
Oh, my.
it's supposed to get cold again. So I teach classes here, but I did a lot of youth ministry in my day. My wife is a pastor, been involved in pastoral ministry for a while, and this book is really trying to wrestle with the future of the church. Is a lot of books for pastors are trying to do that, but trying to give us a picture of how it is that God might encounter us in and through the relationships we form within our churches. And maybe the church is a place of kind of relational encounters where I'm kind of pushing in this book.
Oh, wow. I've been to St. Paul once. I went out there. It's cold. I went and it was snowing. Never drove in snow in my life. I'm from Texas. And I'm like, Lord, how do you drive in this? And
Yeah, a lot of prayer.
it is very cold out there.
It is.
So when you wrote this book, how long did it take you to put this together?
Oh, I think to write it itself, it probably was about 9 to 11 months, probably.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And then how about your research and studying? How did you research it? I mean, relational. Tell us what that means.
Yeah. Well, what I'm actually looking at is, I grew up in the youth ministry world, and we tended to use relationships as kind of a tool of ministry, kind of using relationships to get to some other means. So, as I was trained in ministry, both within pastoral ministry and youth ministry, the idea of the relationship was to use the relationship as a way or as a bridge to get somewhere else. And the more I thought about that, and the more I looked at kind of the tradition of Christian thought as well as the biblical text, there was something missing in that the relationships, I think, that we're led into through who God is and in and through Jesus Christ is a relationship that really isn't for an end, but is for participating in each other's life. And actually, to participate in the life of Jesus is to participate in the life of God. And so I think that there's ways, and I was really drawing a lot in this book on Matthew 25, that this sense of sharing becomes really important. That as we share in the life of one another, we share in the life of Jesus Christ. So that's really kind of where I'm pushing in this book, is to think about how sharing becomes this paradigm. So my research on that was both kind of through classic theological texts as well as through my own experience in ministry and watching my wife pastor this little church in Minneapolis, and how sharing becomes a fundamental paradigm, I think, for who God is, and then how we can take some concrete practices within that.
So what should people get from this? Is this for laymen, or is this for anyone in the church? What should they expect they should get out of it?
Well, I mean, the book is written first and foremost for the pastor.
Okay.
However, I think it's relevant beyond just the pastor. And I think that what you'll take away from it, I mean, it's a book that will challenge the reader to kind of read deeply, but I think it will connect with, and I try to connect it directly with our experiences in ministry. And I think what we'll take away from it, I mean, if this is the elevator talk, what you take away from this book is this idea that Jesus Christ encounters us in and through relationships themselves. That relationships aren't a tool for ministry, but relationships are actually the sanctuary of God's encountering us. And that the Christian life is one of being in relationship with and for each other.
Wow, now, did you get a lot of stories from your wife as well? And when you're putting this together, give us some examples.
Yeah, well, I mean, probably the biggest example from our little church in Minneapolis was at the end of the book, I try to articulate, how do you actually live this out? I mean, what does this look like? And I call it some vistas of what this might look like. And in our church, one of the core things we do to kind of live out this paradigm of sharing, as a way of sharing each other as we share in Jesus Christ, is to pray together.
Amen.
And so we've kind of formulated at the center of our congregation, the prayers of the people have become really significant. But one of the things we've tried to model for people as they do this is that when they share their prayer requests, and we're a small church, we worship about 70, 80 people, is that people are invited to come forward and share their prayer requests. We've kind of modeled that as they do that, to share them in narrative shape, to not just share them as bullet points, like I pray for people who have lost their jobs, but to, in a few short minutes, a minute and a half, share your prayer request in narrative shape. And in our little church, we've been doing that. So people come forward and will say something like, I want to pray for people who lost their jobs, because last Saturday night, I had dinner with my brother who was just laid off from Delta Northwest.
Oh, wow.
And when we when we were with him over dinner, he looked really scared. He's 63 and he still needs to work, but he doesn't know if he's going to get a job. So this kind of idea of sharing your prayer requests as narrative, as story, leads in this kind of beautiful spiritual way of sharing each other's lives as we go before God together. And so that's one of the practices from my wife's little church that we're trying to do.
Now you have a title called Sipping the Sweet Hard Liquor of Individualism. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, part of my argument is this whole idea of using relationships as a means to an end, of trying to use relationship as kind of leverage to get people to come to church or whatever that end might be. I really think that ministry practice that we've lived with maybe for a number of decades that I'm trying to critique in the book is really embedded in something that is not necessarily very Christian, which is this idea that you are an individual, that you are what you're interested in, that you are cut free to get whatever you want. And so I'm trying to put this in a more classic theological, biblical framework of thinking of people not as individuals, but actually as persons, that we actually are our relationships, that we are brothers and sisters one to another, and are given that through being in relationship and not just being individuals who get to do whatever we want. And seeing the church that way. I think the church often functions as trying to meet individual people's interests instead of being communities that actually share in each other's life.
Wow, that's good. Now, have you had any testimonies of some pastors that may have picked up your book and started just to at least ponder on it? I mean, you ponder on a subject like this and think, am I really reaching, or can I reach better?
Yeah, I mean, I have. I mean, the book is new out. I mean, it's only been out for about 4 weeks, so the stories are starting to kind of come in as the book gets out there. One of the things I did at the very end of the book, there's an appendix, and my wife is in a pastors group in the St. Paul area, Lutheran and Presbyterian pastors,
okay.
And they're in a kind of grant group. And so I asked them to read the book and to give me feedback, and then ask them to write practices that they do in their own church that kind of live into this framework, and those are then published in the back of the book. So the testimonials are slowly kind of rolling in, but they're actually wanted to kind of front that and have that in the text itself. So you can find in the appendix about 10 stories of people living into this.
And is that the Portraits of Relational Pastors?
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Now tell us about the title, Can I Read Your Mind? And you're comparing the brain science and relational ministry. Yeah.
I mean, Can You Read My Mind? It comes from my son, who we had a babysitter, and he came home from school, and he was looking around in our kitchen, in our refrigerator, and she kept on asking him, Owen, do you need anything? No, Owen, do you need anything? He just completely ignored her. And then he was in the kind of the baskets of our refrigerator, and she said, Owen, are you looking for an apple? And he turned to her. He was like 5 at the time, and he turned to her and he said, whoa, can you read my mind? And so that's where the title comes from. But what I try to do in that chapter is look at some of the new, very interesting work on neuroscience and how neuroscience is functioning. One of the interesting things they say in neuroscience is that our brains are actually social relational organs, that they only work as they are in connection with other brains, and that our brains really are wired to be able to share in each other's lives, that we are particularly created in a way to see each other and to share in each other's lives as we kind of recognize nonverbals and share. So that's kind of the idea of that, is to think about, it's not like this Star Trek way that we read each other's minds, but there's a sense as human beings.
You're scaring me, Andrew.
Yeah, that we can kind of sense what people are feeling.
Yeah.
We know this when we preach sermons, like really aware of people.
You can sense it. I mean, when you walk in a room, you can tell when someone's sad, when someone's happy, without even talking to them, and not just with facial expressions. It's almost like you can pick that up.
You can pick it up, and some of the neuroscience stuff is starting to say that we're particularly created in this way to kind of connect. And so I'm trying to take that again as another analogy of sharing and push it deeper with some theological and biblical frameworks.
Wow. We're again talking to Andrew Root, author of The Relational Pastor, and I want you to just share with them your contact information if you want to share any of that with us.
Yeah, my website is just andrewroot.org. You can find me there, and there's a way to kind of email me if you need to do that, and I'd be happy to respond to anyone who's got a question.
Amen. Thank you, Andrew, for being on the air with us, and we'll be back with the show.